Hello everyone, and welcome to Area 616. Today I've decided to do my first comics versus movie episode. This is a series where I take a character or storyline from the comics and then compare them to the movie equivalent to determine what changes were made and why, and of course which one is truly better. So, for the first episode, Ultron is an iconic and long-standing enemy of the Avengers. He was first introduced in comic form in Avengers issue 55 way back in 1968, created by writer Roy Thomas and artist John Buscema. Since then, he's appeared in multiple Marvel storylines, not only fighting the Avengers but other characters too, like the Guardians of the Galaxy, and he even had his own event comic in 2013 titled Age of Ultron by Brian Michael Bendis and Brian Hitch. He was finally brought to movie form in 2015's Avengers Age of Ultron, in which he was portrayed by James Spader. So now that the history's out of the way, let's get to it. So both Ultron's origins are pretty similar in a lot of ways. They were both created by Avengers members, and they both ended up turning evil and then trying to take over the world. The main difference is who created them. In the comics, it was Hank Pym, but in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Pym is currently an older man who is now a retired superhero. So in the movies, it was changed to Tony Stark with a little help from Bruce Banner. This ends up making a lot more sense in the MCU anyway, but is it a change that improves upon the comics? Well, maybe. In the comics, Hank Pym and Ultron have always had this interesting, almost father-son relationship. In fact, Ultron frequently refers to him as father. They hate each other, but Ultron was created with Hank Pym's brain patterns, so they ultimately understand each other. In the movies, Ultron is not necessarily created by Stark, more transferred. Apparently, he was actually a computer program that was, for some reason, inside of Loki's staff from the first Avengers movie. I don't know why, but there you go. So because of that, Ultron is not born with a bond with Tony, he just plain hates him. This is actually kind of a wasted potential, as it completely erases some interesting ideas. For instance, if Ultron turned evil but was created with basically Hank Pym's brain, doesn't that mean he is kind of Hank Pym? It leads to Hank and the other Avengers questioning his morality, and starts Hank on the long path which ultimately led him to becoming Yellow Jacket. There is definitely tension between the Avengers in the movie about Tony creating Ultron, but by the end Tony hasn't really changed at all. In fact, none of them really have. But I think that leads to perhaps the biggest change from the comics. In the comics, there's a reason Ultron is one of the Avengers' most iconic villains and one of my favorites. The reason being, he's almost completely impossible to defeat. He's a computer after all, an AI. He isn't capable of the emotion-related pitfalls that villains typically have. So when he shows up, he doesn't mess around with the Avengers. He always has a plan to quickly take them out. And they always just barely win. Every time Ultron comes back, he's stronger and smarter than the last time. And that's the thing, he always comes back. Because no matter how many bodies the Avengers destroy, he can just download his brain into another computer or one of Tony Stark's Iron Man suits and just start working on his next plan. They can't stop him, they can only slow him down, which means logically there will come a day when Ultron comes back and he's simply too powerful for the Avengers to take down. And that's what the Age of Ultron comic is about. An alternate reality where Ultron defeated the Avengers, Fantastic Four, X-Men, and all the other heroes of Earth and completely conquered the planet in just 8 hours. That's insane. The only reason they got out is because of a confusing time travel story involving Wolverine and Invisible Woman that kinda sucked, but that's beside the point. The point is, Ultron is bad news. So, how does the movie portray his ruthlessness and raw power?
People create smaller people? Children. I lost the word there. Children.
Not well. Not well at all. I don't even know where to start. This version of Ultron is just simply terrible. First of all, why is he cracking jokes? He's an AI. Why would his logical computer brain think, oh, I should waste time cracking jokes? The answer is, it wouldn't. Joss Whedon explained this by saying that being as how he was created by Tony Stark, he has his ego and sarcasm, but, no. He wasn't created by Tony Stark. He was in Loki's scepter. Remember, writer of the movie who's just trying to come up with an excuse to justify turning Ultron into Loki 2.0? I mean, look at this. He's constantly being thrown around and punched off screen by the Avengers like a rag doll. This is the guy who conquered the entire planet before lunchtime in the comics.
You know, with the benefit of hindsight.
With Loki, it made sense and was actually funny, as he'd come to Earth thinking he was this high and mighty god who was going to crush the mortals under his boot like ants, only to find out that they aren't going to be so easy to step on in the first place.
It's all the same to you. I'll have that drink now.
It worked in the first movie, but in Age of Ultron, they needed an actual threat, a new one, not just a villain that retreads old ground. He even has an army of disposable paper villains like Loki's Chitauri. Ultron does sometimes have an army in the comics, but they're all equally tough. They aren't just easily torn apart, each one is a challenge on their own, making them an even bigger challenge altogether. And that's not even mentioning Ultron's plan. Instead of the hundreds of other ways he could easily wipe out the human race, he decides to take a city, put rocket thingies under it, fly it up really high in the air, and then drop it down like a meteor. That sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? The movie explains it as he just wants it to be super dramatic and stuff, but let's face it, it's not Ultron who wants it to be over the top, it's Joss Whedon. This movie took Ultron, who was a brilliant character in the comics, and changed him into a generic one-off villain who's easily defeated, all for the sake of making Ultron like the first movie. When what they really needed to do to make a superior sequel is make it more intense, darker, make the villain an enormous challenge, and have emotional repercussions for the Avengers that help lead into Civil War. The movie doesn't really do any of that, which is why I say that the comics version of Ultron is ultimately the superior version of the character.
Oh, for God's sake!
But what do you think? Do you agree? Are there any other characters you'd like to see me do a comics versus movie video on? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and remember, 15 days until Luke Cage comes to Netflix.
I'm about sick of always having to buy new clothes.